Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator, and this is the next part in my video series looking at historical police weapons. So it all started off with a simple truncheon. We all know what a truncheon is and what a truncheon's used for. We maybe don't all know how a truncheon's used, and in fact there isn't necessarily one way of using a truncheon. I think they've been used in various different ways at different times by different police forces. And we looked at the Negan's baseball bat, Lucille version of the police truncheon, Victorian police truncheon. I haven't yet found out exactly who used this and what it was for. I know it's British and I know it's Victorian because it's marked VR on it, but I think it's probably something akin to riot police or something like that. Then we looked at police hanger or police sword. Now, something I didn't mention in the previous video talking about police hanger, I can't show it to you because I've sold it and it's now living in America. So, and I think that the new owner will be watching this video, so I hope you're enjoying it. But I'm sure I'll get more of those in the future, and I will look them out because they are a great little sword, and I think they're good value for money for nicely made little sword. But what I didn't explicitly go into in that last video was that there are other types of police sword. Now, that type of police sword, the model of the kind of 1850s, 1860s, and that example probably dates to the 1890s, but they were a continuous design for the whole second half of the 19th century, in Britain at least. And I should also mention other countries had their own versions of those. We see Prussian police swords and French police swords and Swedish police swords. The Swedes, incidentally, were still using or carrying police swords until the 1960s. And a number of different Swedish people have told me, independently from each other, this may be an urban legend or it may be true, I don't know. They weren't sharpened, but apparently during riot control, the Swedes used to go up to the curb by the side of the street and bash the edge of their swords on the curb to roughen up the edges so that it did more damage when they clouted rioters with them. Lovely. So lots of different nations, in fact most nations, had some form of sword for their constabulary. Now, in most cases, not always the case, but in most cases, those swords or cutlasses or hangers weren't carried as routine. They weren't carried every day. Usually they were carried in times of extreme concern about civil unrest or for particular missions, for particular purposes, sometimes for guarding things and sometimes for ceremony purposes as well. And I should also mention that officers, police officers, certainly in Britain, and I know this was the case in many other European countries, police officers very often carried swords that weren't like police swords that we're talking about here, that were actually like army officers' swords. So, for example, I have seen a couple of swords. In fact, I own one sword I might look at in a separate video that that belonged to police officers that look like army officers' swords. They usually have some details that are different, some details of the hilt or the blade or both. One of the most famous examples is the Irish constabulary officer's sword. And they look exactly like an army officer's sword, except for they have a particular type of what's known as the flat solid blade. So in other words, with no fuller. And they're very nice swords, actually. So, you know, why? Why was that the case? Well, I think it was partly for ceremony, partly for appearances. But we have to remember, policing in the 19th century had quite a different feel and nature to it than policing does today. At least, hopefully, in most parts of the world. Certainly in Britain it does. And you know, if we look at Britain, for example, because that's what I know most about, Britain, of course, was one country, but it ruled over an empire. And policing, for example, in India or Egypt, could essentially amount to, the police force was essentially a bit like a part of the military, okay? You know, in France, you have gendarmes, and in Italy, the carabinieri. And these are essentially halfway between military and police. They're military police. And in Britain, we didn't exactly have that, but we did have British for example, in Crete. So in Crete there was a gendarmerie, and it was made up of international force. A lot of I think Serbians and Montenegrins and other people from the Balkans were in it, but generally speaking they got staff from elsewhere, so they didn't have divided loyalties with the local population. And then they usually had officers, certainly in parts of the British Empire, who were British or sometimes French or German or Italian or Swiss or whatever. So in Egypt, for example, in the 1880s, Egypt, complicated story that I won't go into the full depth of it. In 1882, there was essentially regime change in Egypt, and it went from being under independent Ottoman control to being under British control. And then obviously later in the 1880s we had the Mahdi, the Mad Mahdi, the dervishes, and the Egyptian and British forces were fighting in the Sudan against the Mahdi's forces. And in many cases the police, the gendarmerie and the police forces were involved in those military campaigns. So now I've set a bit of context, I'm going to show you a sword, which is, I'm sure, what you're mostly watching this channel for, is to see weapons, isn't it? Rather than just listening to me talk. Maybe you like listening to me talk, I don't know. But so this is a sword, which I don't know a huge amount about, but because I run Eastern Antique Arms website, I occasionally get contacted by people who want to sell antiques, and they send me some pictures, and if I'm interested I sometimes buy them. In this case it was someone who was relatively local. He had an antique sword, didn't really know where it had come from. He knew it had been in the family for a bit. I could see that the hilt was covered in gold paint, which I have cleaned off. But it's on the surface of it, it looks like a cavalry sword. Okay, so it is more or less an 1821 pattern light cavalry officer's sword. The same pattern, incidentally, was used by Royal Artillery officers, usually with some slight differences in the design, but basically the same pattern. So the 1821 pattern light cavalry officer's sword, or Royal Artillery officer's sword, that's what it looks like. And it's in a field service scabbard. The field service scabbard being wood and leather, to be worn with a frog and a Sam Brown belt, rather than the type that has two rings and hangs by two slings and hangers. So this type came about it first appears in about the 1850s and 60s, but it didn't become popular until the 1870s and really the 1880s. Okay, so on the surface of it, looking at it, this looks like a kind of 1870s, 1880s sword, but it could be later, it could be 1890s, because the design didn't change an awful lot. Okay, but the thing which is interesting is when you take it out of the scabbard. Okay, so let's dispense with the scabbard there. So still on the surface of it, it looks like a nice, good quality, well-made, light cavalry officer's sword, which is kind of what it is. But on the other side, it has something rather unusual. There we go. So hopefully you can read what that says. And it's fairly self-explanatory. It says Hong Kong Police. So here's an unusual thing. It's what appears to be a light cavalry officer's sword. It has not been service sharpened. Okay, so it's not sharp, although it does come to quite a thin edge, quite a fine edge. It's possible that it was sharpened and then had the edge polished off again, but I don't think so. I don't think it's ever been service sharpened. And it says very clearly on one side, Hong Kong Police. Now that's a pretty unusual thing in itself. On this side, it says Parker Field and Sons. Now, Parker Field and Son were a very famous maker of police equipment. Now, they didn't only make police equipment, and there's been some amount of debate on the internet about whether, if you find a sword with Parker Field and Son on it, does that mean it's a police sword? Well, for a start, I have to say that like 95 or more % of all the swords with Parker Field and Son etched on them are police swords. But few people I know, myself included, have had swords which don't seem to be police swords, which are nevertheless marked to Parker Field and Son. So it does seem that in some cases they were selling equipment for military officers, possibly. Or the other possibility is that these other swords, which don't appear to be police swords, are in fact police swords. It's difficult to say at this point. More research needs to be done, but all we need to, for the purposes of this video, to say is that Parker, Field and Son were primarily, they're based in Holborn in London. I've worked around that area actually and went to university in that area. So it's just north of Oxford Street in central London. And they were based there, and they mostly sold equipment either on contract or privately, personally, for military personnel. Now, what's interesting is this truncheon that started off the whole series of videos that I'm doing here is at the bottom on the underneath marked Field 23 Holborn. Now, Field is what became or was Parker, Field and Son. So these two items, for all I know, could have been in their shop at the same time. It's unlikely, but it's more likely the Hong Kong police sword was provided directly and not sold through the shop. But the fact is that these two items were supplied, not made, supplied by the same company, by Parker, Field and Son. And in fact, if you look at British police truncheons or handcuffs or things like this from the second half of the 19th century, you'll find an extraordinarily large percentage of them are marked to either Field or Parker, Field and Son on them because they were the main supplier of police stuff. So coming back to this sword, we have 2 points of reference for what this is and who supplied it. We know it's Hong Kong police etched on one side and supplied by Parker, Field and Son, who were predominantly a supplier of police equipment. So I think we can say without a shadow of a doubt that this was a sword made for the Hong Kong police. Now, the question is, why is it in the form of a light cavalry officer's sword? I don't know, okay? If anybody out there knows more about the Victorian era police, then feel free to share your opinions with me. I think there's several possibilities. Number one, some police are mounted, okay? So it's entirely possible that this was for a mounted police officer or mounted police, maybe not even an officer, just a constable. I don't know, maybe it's for mounted police. The other possibility is it's for a police officer to wear as his dress sword. I think that that's less likely because the blade isn't decorated in really any way except for the Parker Field makers thing and Hong Kong police, although it is possible. So I think they're the two main possibilities, that either this was for mounted police based in Hong Kong or it was for a Hong Kong police officer to wear for parade purposes, for full dress. It's a good quality sword, it's nicely made. It's got a shagreen, that is shark skin grip with copper grip wire, just as a cavalry officer's sword has. It's not of reduced proportions at all. It's a full-size cavalry officer's sword with a relatively broad blade, 1¼ inches at the base. It would have had a leather washer at the base, which is missing, but everything's still nice, rock solid and tight on it. So it's a really, really nice sword. I'm actually going to be, because it doesn't really fit in my collection, I will be selling this, but it's a very interesting sword, and it does come back to the point that swords absolutely were used by police forces, by foot police, mounted police, but by police officers for a whole range of purposes, sometimes for riot control, sometimes for military purposes in some parts of the world, such as Egypt or India, where sometimes there were actually insurgencies and the police worked with the military to put down those insurgencies, and also for ceremonial purposes as well. Anyway, so there is the final look of a confirmed cavalry sword, cavalry officer's sword for a police force, in this case the Hong Kong police. If any of you have any more information to share on the Hong Kong police or why they may have been using a cavalry officer's sword, then please share below and I will see you for the next video. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We've got extra videos on Patreon, t-shirts on Spreadshirt, and I hope to see you for the next video.